My Lord Provost, Mrs. Maxwell Scott, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honour to propose that we drink to the memory of Sir Walter Scott. I use this phrase in a sense not merely conventional, because a great honour it is, albeit a heavy and alarming responsibility, to be entrusted with a task which has brought out the best in so many distinguished predecessors. And yet the subject is unexhausted, being probably inexhaustible. Except for the specialist, there's a limit to what can be said of a poet, a novelist, a historian, a lawyer, an antiquarian, and Scott was any of these. A figure so circumscribed is like a comet. For a brief space every half-century, he may be illuminated by the bright light of a revived academic criticism. There will follow years of neglect and probably of contempt. Thus, Scott's poems and his novels may go up and down in public esteem. But by some magical process, Scott himself, in person, avoids these thermometric variations, and year by year his friends gather for the purpose of honouring not so much the works he left as the memory of the man himself, and they try to find something new to say. Certainly that's my ambition this evening. Looking at Scott as a child of his time, which, although it rather liked to think of itself as the age of enlightenment, had some pretty dark sides to it, I would say that what distinguishes Scott is that he was beloved. I know this sounds perhaps a mawkish and sentimental judgment, but I choose the word because it does seem to explain much of what otherwise is inexplicable. For example, we have to remind ourselves how much more bitter were political differences and controversies in time past than they are today. We sometimes think that a few of our politicians have a nice or nasty taste in the polemical, but either it is nothing compared to what our forefathers were accustomed to, as I incline to think myself, or else we have all entered into a conspiracy to pay no attention to our right honourable masters. That may come someday. But take a modern illustration. When I was elected to the Faculty of Advocates nearly 40 years ago, there existed the remnants of a tradition, not always observed, but disregarded at the cost of unfavourable notice taken by the older hands, that one member of faculty did not oppose another as a parliamentary candidate. The bitterness of the feelings which was said to be thereby generated were supposed to be incompatible with that friendly personal relationship out of court, which was, and indeed is to this day, indispensable to the due administration of justice. But no one would suppose such a thing today. The 18th and 19th centuries were in this respect far worse than anything we have ever known. Political strife would split brother and sister, house and house, parent and child, let alone professed advocates. We have to remember that at least two of our wars, the American and the Napoleonic, were in a sense civil wars, inasmuch as there existed during both a body of respectable political opinion in the British state which was far from unsympathetic to the formally declared enemies of Britain. Even the parties were split. There could hardly have been two more deeply dyed Tories than Johnson and Boswell. Yet you remember how profoundly shocked the pro-American Boswell was when the doctor burst out, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" So too, many people in Britain regarded Napoleon as the democratic saviour of Europe from the shackles of an aristocratic tyranny. The consequence was inevitable. One side regarded the other not with contempt for the perverse, but with loathing for the treasonable. This is the stuff of which hatred is made, and the strength of it then we can clearly see now. Yet it hardly touched Scott, who made no secret whatever about where he stood as he pranced about as quartermaster of offensible cavalry, daring Boney to do his worst. There was, of course, a little trouble later with some radicals at the Selkirk poll, but what surprises one is his calm relationship with his Whig friends. Scott was beloved by no one more than Cockburn, some of whose opinions, expressed as we now feel with rather less than a decent candour, must have been as tiresome to Scott as many of Scott's were to most of the Edinburgh reviewers. Yet Scott's strong and cheerful friendships among the members of that brilliant circle flourished under what one would have thought to have been an impossible strain. If then there was an inner quality in Scott which could perform this miracle, we may conclude, I think, that it's this quality and not his literary achievements which brings each year to the dinner table so heterogeneous an audience. And year by year, that quality inspires your president, whatever the precise topic of his address may be. I think I'm at once in duty bound to confess to my audience that I shall not take, because I am not qualified to take, any very highly sophisticated or deeply learned line with them. Here I'm departing from the traditions of the past, but this is a measure of my inadequacy. Apart from the giants who have from time immemorial addressed our club, proconsuls, archbishops, diplomats, I can remember in recent years being enthralled by the literary graces of Dr. Melville Clark and Professor Dykes, inspired by the eloquence of Lord Cameron, and charmed by the neighbourly appreciation of Sir Alec Douglas Hume. But I am tonight to paint on a small canvas with soft colours a picture still of the beloved Sir Walter, but of him in his hours of ease, far from home, in the small compass of a few intimate friends and of some members of a profession to which he was a stranger. He has left his own record of this rather remote incident in his life, and there's a small amount of information about it to be gleaned from others. It may have been the happiest period of his life. It was unconnected with his own profession, with financial cares, or with any kind of territorial grandeurs. And it shows how he was beloved, and also, I hope, why. Pharos loquitur. Far on the bosom of the deep, o'er these wild waves my watch I keep, a ruddy gleam of changeful light bound on the dusky brow of night. The seaman bids my lustre hail, and scorns to strike his timorous sail. Not great poetry, you may say, and in all loyalty, since the lines were written by Sir Walter, I will perhaps be constrained to agree. They were written by him, as Lockhart testifies, in the album of the Bell Rock Lighthouse on the morning of the 30th of July, 1814. And we must see how that came about. The commissioners of northern lighthouses were constituted by a statute of 1786, which empowered them to erect lighthouses at Kinnaird Head in Fraserburgh, at North Ronaldsay in Orkney, at Eilean Glass off the island of Scalpay in the Minch, and at the Mull of Kintyre. Before that time, only on the Isle of May had any light been regularly exhibited. You probably know that the commissioners then, as now, consisted of the law officers, certain Lord Provosts, magistrates and bailies, and certain sheriffs of counties. Today, one could hardly justify the setting up of such a body to carry out such duties. But before we develop that platitude into an adverse criticism, let us reflect that if we were to demand that all our institutions be subjected to the test of an earnest a priori justification, the existence of many exemplars of our national genius would be in jeopardy. We must also concede that our lighthouse authority is administered with an efficiency second to none and at a fraction of the cost of many. So too we must ponder the fact that when the Isle of Man desired to establish on her shores much needed lighthouses, she turned not to the powerful Trinity House nor to the neighbouring Irish authority, but to our own commissioners who have charge of her lights at this hour. Each year, some of the commissioners are appointed a committee to inspect a portion of the service under their charge, and this they mostly do by sea. It was in company with that committee that Sir Walter found himself at the Inchcape. Most of you will be familiar with the sight of the fine ship Pharos, whose regular berth is at Granton, and it is she who, among her more strenuous duties, carries the Committee of Inspection today. But we are going to look at the voyage of 1814. You will be surprised to hear, I have it on the highest authority, that the commissioner's ship of that date bore no name, being merely known as the Lighthouse Yacht. She was of 82 tons register, which is worth remembering as we sail with her through Samborough Roost and the Pentland Firth. Although Sir Walter was in 1814 a sheriff, he was not one of those whom the statute designated as a commissioner. He joined the ship as a guest, and as a guest he was shipmates with the committee for over 2 months. His log opens with the words, July 29th, 1814, sailed from Leith about 1 o'clock on board the Lighthouse Yacht, conveying 6 guns and 10 men, commanded by Mr. Wilson. The company, commissioners of the Northern Lights, Robert Hamilton, Sheriff of Lanarkshire, William Erskine, Sheriff of Orkney and Zetland, Adam Duff, Sheriff of Lanarkshire. Non-commissioners, ipse ego, Mr. David Marchbanks, son to John Marchbanks, Provost of Edinburgh, the Reverend Mr. Turnbull, Minister of Tingwall in the Presbytery of Scotland. But the official chief of the expedition is Mr. Stevenson, the Surveyor Viceroy over the commissioners, a most gentlemanlike and modest man, and well known by his scientific skill. Well, it's not my purpose to quote at length from this journal, which most of you must be perfectly familiar with. But the same Mr. Stevenson, Surveyor Viceroy, has given us a good deal more information, which may serve as an acceptable supplement. Many years after this voyage, he set down his Reminiscences of Sir Walter Scott. His manuscript was published in Scribner's Magazine for 1893, with a prefatory note written by his grandson, Robert Louis Stevenson. That note contains a tribute to his grandfather's character not less warm than that of Sir Walter. His literary powers are also acknowledged. The well-known account of the building of the Bell Rock Lighthouse is described as the Robinson Crusoe of engineering, and the circumstances in which the reminiscences were set down are told with a gentle pathos. In 1850, my grandfather began to ail early in the year and chafed for the period of the annual voyage, which was his medicine and his delight. In vain his sons dissuaded him from the adventure. The day approached. The obstinate old gentleman was found in his room furtively packing a portmanteau, and the truth had to be told him ere he would desist, that he was stricken with a malignant malady, and before the yacht should have completed the circuit of the lights, must himself have departed on a more distant cruise. My father has more than once told me of the scene with emotion. The old man was intrepid. He had faced death before with a firm countenance, and I do not suppose he was much dashed at the nearness of our common destiny. But there was something else that would cut him to the quick: the loss of the cruise and the end of all his cruising, the knowledge that he had looked his last on Sombra and the wild crags of Skye, and that sound of Mull, with the praise of which his letters were so often occupied, that he was never again to hear the surf break on Clashcarnach, never again to see lighthouse after lighthouse, all younger than himself, and for the more part of his own device, open in the hour of the dusk their flowers of fire, or the topaz and the ruby interchange on the summit of the Bell Rock. To a life of so much activity and danger, the life's work of so much interest and essential beauty, there came a long farewell. It was in this spring and summer, at first impatiently expecting to revisit the scenes commemorated, and afterwards awaiting death in his own house, and following with his mind's eye the course of the yacht now gone without him, that he turned with a memory already dim and wrote with a hand already failing his Reminiscences of Scott. That little work bears the characteristic mark of evidence given long after the event. The length of the interval doesn't necessarily cast doubt on the veracity of the incidents described. It causes facts and impressions to be selective, only those remaining in the memory of the narrator which struck him particularly at the time. But we are given ample corroboration of the happiness and fun which Sir Walter contributed to the voyage. You may remember how he summed it up himself. "So closes my journal," he said, "but I mustn't omit to say that among 5 or 6 persons, some of whom were doubtless different in tastes and pursuits, there didn't occur during the close communication of more than 6 weeks aboard a small vessel the slightest difference of opinion. Thus ends my little excursion, in which, bating one circumstance which must have made me miserable for the time whenever I had learnt it," he refers to the death of the Duchess of Buccleuch, "I have enjoyed as much pleasure as in any 6 weeks of my life. We had constant exertion, a succession of wild and uncommon scenery, good humour on board, and objects of animation and interest when we went ashore. Sed fugit interior, fugit irrevocabile tempus." Mr. Stevenson shows us the same picture from another angle. Sir Walter, he says, had the happy talent of being on easy terms with all around him. When it was convenient, he often took a seat in the forecastle and entered into familiar conversation with the sailors on the watch below. There was a particular seat which he occupied there, which was called his locker. In this way, he used to say that he got much information, talking with everyone in his own line of pursuit. And my own reason for reviving the old gentleman's memoirs is exactly the same as his grandson's, whose words I will presume to borrow. It seems worthwhile, for the love of Sir Walter, to give these notes a commemoration of type. Once again, on the faith of a new witness, we find the same Scott represented, healthy, happy, regardful, intrepid and enthusiastic, a man of 10 million. The time would fail to pursue closely the voyage from Leith to Greenock via Port Rush, where they missed an American privateer by one day, a circumstance which caused the aforesaid 6 guns to be loaded. It's just a question of filling in a few details where they seem to make a clearer picture. For example, the first place they visited was the Isle of May, where, as Stevenson says, on the top of the island, the old coal lighthouse tower, being now considered an encumbrance, was intended to be taken down. But Sir Walter, noticing the date 1636, with a face and rays emblematical of light over the door, remonstrated against the removal of the old tower, which has since been converted into a pilot's barrack. This is a highly characteristic touch. He tells us a little more about the visit to the Inchcape on the following day. It was a rough morning when the party for the Rock were mustered on deck, and Stevenson says some of them were looking white. So he ordered the steward to put up a good Scotch breakfast in hampers. These were carried to the lighthouse, where the grateful men sat down to their meal. Then the album was produced for their signatures, as it is at all lighthouses to this day, and Erskine said, "Now, Scott, you must give us something more than Walter Scott." After a few moments' thought, Pharos Loquitur was inscribed. The account finishes, "After spending all the time on the Rock, which the flowing tide would admit, we went splashing along the railway to the boats, and getting on board of the tender, we soon reached Arbroath." To those of us who, in face of a flood tide, have gone splashing along the same railway over the rocks, now almost awash, to the launch, the description raises a vivid memory. But the words, "we soon reached Arbroath," may do less than justice to the situation, since Scott's account is, "run down through a rough sea to Aberbrothock, vulgarly called Arbroath. All sick, even Mr. Stevenson." The greater part of Scott's journal is concerned with the time spent in Orkney and Zetland, and not a great deal is added by Mr. Stevenson to that account. But one detail stands out in its modernity. It's the kind of complaint that we hear today, and may perhaps have to listen to for long enough. Scott was much surprised to hear that Zetland, with a population described as 60,000, which seems a large one, had no regular post. Letters, says Stevenson, were at that time sent by chance coasting vessels, the masters of the vessels receiving the fee of a penny for each letter delivered. "Are we really," exclaimed Scott, "in a county of the British dominions, where we can neither hear from our friends nor be heard by them?" Such, observes Stevenson, was the little importance attached to Zetland as late as 1820. But his grandson remarks in a footnote, "and, as I see by my grandfather's journals, for at least 10 years later." Perhaps we may classify Scott's rhetorical question with his observation when they encountered two Gravesend smacks fishing off the Fair Isle. "Lord," he said, "what a long draught London makes." The account given by Erskine to Lockhart of the profound effect on Scott of the scenery of Loch Corruisk, as we call it now, has always seemed to me rather mannered and to savour too much of the age of sensibility. So I prefer the straightforward and practical version given by Stevenson. On all occasions, he says, Sir Walter was most pointed in attending to the boat arrangements ashore, but at Corruisk he threw us out of our time and tide reckoning. It became necessary at length to send a sailor to say we should be too late for Strathaird's cave. When the man returned, he said that Sir Walter would be at the boat immediately, adding, "It was strange that he did not look as if he knew me, although he saw me coming." When he did join the party, he was still quite absorbed in thought, and said little till we landed to walk over the neck of land to the cave. Erskine's account is that he was quite overwhelmed with his feelings, which is not very likely, since Scott used to poke fun at Erskine's reaction to Stafford. "Would you believe it," he said, "my poor Willie sat down and wept like a woman." It's more likely that the honest sailor found Scott in the course of composition, which would be an ample explanation of his appearance of abstraction. The voyage to Skye involved, naturally, a call at Dunvegan, and here I am in debt to an article by Mr. Seaton Gordon in the SMT magazine from 1932. He quotes a charmingly characteristic letter preserved at the castle, thanking Mrs. MacLeod of MacLeod for the gift of a beautiful purse of your own workmanship, and sending her a copy of The Lord of the Isles. The latter, he says, has had one good consequence to the author, that it has served to replenish the purse with which the Lady Macleod presented him. Yet he has so much the spirit of the old bard that he values the purse more than the contents. And we have here an instance which Sir Walter would have appreciated of how time can be telescoped. The autocratic piper he describes must have been Ian Dhu MacKinnon, the last of the hereditary pipers, who died in 1822 in his 91st year. At the other end of the scale, he had been accompanied at Loch Carrusk by a Highland boy. Of the latter, Mr. Seaton Gordon says, Mr. James Cameron of Talisker informs me that his father used to say that this boy was subsequently in his employment and often spoke of the day when he had acted as guide to Sir Walter Scott, whom he described as a tall, lame man with shepherd's tartan trousers. These are presumably the garments which later that day came to grief at Strathaird's cave, where, as the wearer says, I slid down the polished sheet of marble which forms the rising ascent, and thereby injured my pantaloons in a way which my jacket is ill calculated to conceal. Mr. Stevenson tells us a little and discreetly of the social side. I might here enter, he says, upon the habits on shipboard of this party of eminent men and public characters. Knowing that they could not carry the comforts of the salt market with them, they were happy and contented with ship's fare little varied. Fortunately, as it happened, there was a good French cook on board, and our steward was an excellent purveyor of such good things as came in his way. The wines in use were port and sherry, good and old in bottle, and on a Sunday, when the weather was favourable for prayers, there was a glass of claret. Often, however, when there was a dampness in the air, a frequent occurrence, a little hot water mixture, which is translated by Robert Louis Stevenson as whisky toddy, was preferred by the elderly gentleman. This evokes a memory. We are lying over the Sabbath in the old steam pharos on her last voyage off Tarbert in Harris, having the Eilean glass light to inspect the next day. The whole party proceeds to the established kirk and is shown into a prominent pew where we sit conspicuous in our blue suits with our white-covered caps at foot, ipsi ego, by the way, not as a commissioner but as a guest. The minister chooses, I'm sure fortuitously, to read from the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. I can still see my shipmates turn and look at one another as verse 15 is reached. These are not drunken as ye suppose, seeing it is but the third hour of the day. The 1814 voyage closed at Greenock with two nice touches. The commissioner's mail was delivered from the shore, but with it nothing for Sir Walter. His arrived a little later by the hand of the postmaster himself, who was not prepared to forego the honour of executing a personal service upon so distinguished a consignee. Finally, when Sir Walter departed in a steamer for Glasgow, a journey, as he says, which we performed at a rate of about 8 miles an hour and with a smoothness of motion which probably resembles flying, we are told by Stevenson that the harbour had quite a birthday appearance with flags and streamers at the mastheads. Such was the celebrity and popularity of the man. Well, what more need I say, except perhaps to adopt by way of peroration the closing words of Robert Louis Stevenson's note. One thing I beg of my readers, that they will take down the 4th volume of Lockhart and read over again The Voyage of the Lighthouse Yacht to Nova Zembla and the Lord knows where, one of the most delightful of passages in one of the most delightful of books. Fellow members and guests, the memory of Sir Walter Scott. Walter Scott.